Tonight, Hollywood's Scary Movie Man returns. I'm Richard.
And I'm Gary, and these are our incredible stories.
Well, good evening to all of our friends and family across the United States and in more than 50 countries around the world. We are thrilled to have you with us again tonight, and Gary and I always know that you're taking time out of a very busy schedule to be with us for a few moments of rest, relaxation, and entertainment. And I think we can both assure you that tonight you're going to get plenty of entertainment value from tonight's episode. So sit back, relax, and join us for a really incredible story or two from the golden days of the golden days of studios.
Studios and classic horror films.
Classic horror films, yeah. Tonight, returning for a second appearance, we have with us an incredible human encyclopedia of all things related to Hollywood's classic scary movies. And his name is Greg Mank. Greg, welcome back to the show. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you. It's very good to be here and very good to be talking to you, Richard and Gary, again. Very good.
Let's go ahead and start off once again and remind our viewers, or for the new folks listening in for the first time, about the two new books that you have out.
Yes, there's a nonfiction book called Angels and Ministers of Grace Defend Us, which is a story about the backgrounds of a number of classic horror films, such as Island of the Lost Souls, Bride of Frankenstein, Werewolf of London, the 1941 Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, so on and so forth, 13 chapters in all. There's a lot of fresh, brand new, recently discovered material that throws some of these films into a very, very much a whole new light. That book is available from McFarland, and also there is a novel that I've written called Frankenstein's Witch, St. Lizzie Pray for Us. This involves the shooting of the classic 1931 horror film Frankenstein, during which time the people in that film, the legendary Boris Karloff, Colin Clive, director James Whale, and so on, become involved with a real-life witch. I say a real-life witch, actually. She's a fictional character, all right? But in the story, she's a real-life witch, all right? So we have a real, it's a wild story, and it covers a lot of different things, a lot of passion in the story, a lot of well, as one of the reviews say, is a redemption, religious mania, sexual obsession, guilt, sin, so on and so forth. It's a lot there. So I think it's an exciting book. A number of the reviews have said that it's a page turner. I think once you get into those characters and see what's going on, both in both sections of the book, both the section that takes place in Hollywood in 1931 and the part that takes place in Southern California in the Summer of Love, 1967. That it, as they say in the beginning of Frankenstein, it may shock you. So, in a positive way, of course. So, both those books are available. You can find them on Amazon, or you can reach me about getting a copy through me, actually, and at my website. And that website is www.gregorymank.com. That's www.gregorymank, all one word, gregorymank.com. And so there I am. Thank you for letting me do my commercial.
Oh, yes. And if people are thinking about doing some Christmas shopping and need an additional item, I'd like to recommend a book called The Very Witching Time of Night. It's by Greg Mank, of course, and it's Dark Alleys of Classic Horror Cinema. Truly a wonderful book also, Greg.
For anybody who wants to have a horror book for Christmas. It's the perfect selection.
That's right. Perfect for holiday giving and getting.
Yeah. Yes. Unless you like to celebrate Halloween by giving gifts, you could do that too. So
well,
there you are.
Last week, we promised Gary, that we would tell our own story about Robert Carradine.
John Carradine.
Oh, John Carradine.
I don't know who that one is. But
No.
John Carradine, I've heard of him. Yeah, because we actually have a connection to John Carradine.
Yes, we do. Have you?
I'm very eager to hear it.
Have you ever heard of a classic cult director by the name of Ted V. Michaels?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, Gary and I worked on 2 of Ted Michaels' sequels to the Astro Zombies, the original Astro Zombies movies.
Oh.
And Gary was second unit director, and I was associate producer, and it was Astro Zombies M3 cloned, and then Astro Zombies M4 Invaders from Cyberspace.
Yes, it was a very interesting experience.
Oh, yeah. Gary really liked working on that one because he also did the special effects, and he got to blow up the Big Ben and some temples
Gate.
in
Oh,
Japan
wow.
and Brandenburg Gate. He had rocks coming down and crushing the people there in Germany at the Brandenburg Gate.
All the fun
that
things
sounds
you get
really
to do.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We were talking about it in a Denny's restaurant
Yeah,
one day.
well, you get a lot of looks when you start talking about
blowing up places.
have to throw that word in special effects so somebody doesn't call the authorities and end up in jail.
Yeah. But anyhow, if you think about it, the original Astro Zombies starred Robert Carradine.
John Carradine.
John Carradine. You know what? I'm thinking of Robert Wise. I'm getting ahead of myself because I want to later on talk to Greg about Robert Wise and Curse of the Gap people. But John Carradine. Okay. One of the stories Ted told us was that when Ted he had his own production company, TVM Global Entertainment, and he actually lived in a castle there in Hollywood.
In Glendale.
In Glendale, yeah. It was a huge castle-like place.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the days he was in the office, John Carradine came by and sat down, talked to Ted, and asked him if he had any roles coming up that his son David could play, because his son David was in need of some work.
Uh-huh.
And Ted didn't at the time, but I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. When you're there in this really closed society in Hollywood, and you know everybody else, you're not shy about asking favors for yourself or your family.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is, much like what you talked about last time you were with us, his performance in Astro Zombies, he didn't hold back or just phone it in. He put a lot of heart and soul right into every single bit of it. And Ted always told us whenever he worked with him, he said that he was one of the most professional actors he had ever worked with.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, he just adored acting, and it was like a sacred calling to him, and and of course, and he did so many terrific things. I mean, he was in all those John Ford films. I mean, he was, he had been on contract at 20th Century Fox in the late 1930s as a character player. He had a very interesting stage career in New York. And of course, he did theater everywhere. I mean, he would do theater, in a restaurant lobby. He would any chance to act, he would jump up and start acting. And he did. It just really sustained him because again, he had a tough personal life. He had a lot of problems and a lot of money difficulties and so on and so forth. Apparently, but he, as long as he could act, he was fine. As long as there would be another role coming up that he could do, then he was always, he always, found the fortitude to go on. And that's very, very interesting that he would come and ask for, work for his son back in those days. Because I think that from what I've read back and forth, David wrote a book about his life, and he said that, there were times when he thought his father might have been a little bit jealous of him. That he was kind of alternated between great pride in David and all his sons who were actors, and also that he was, but at the same time, it was kind of like, he was the great Carradine, and he didn't want necessarily for, to be upstaged by his own brood. But that's a great story. I'm really glad that he, that he went up the bat for David that early in his career.
Yeah. Wasn't he in Stagecoach with John Wayne?
He sure was. Yep, he's in Stagecoach, and it's interesting. He's the only character in the great chase, the magnificent chase with near the climax of the picture, in which the Navajos are chasing the stagecoach, and they have that big passenger, all those passengers crowded into the coach and on top of the coach and so on and so forth. And Carradine's the only one that doesn't make it. He's the only one who gets shot and dies. So
poor John.
They carry him out at the end. Yeah. So he doesn't know. He doesn't survive the probably the most famous Western Navajo attack of all movies. But he beat that and drums along the Mohawk and the Grapes of Wrath and just he some of the greatest movies ever made and some of the worst.
Yeah. And the fact that you're in some of the greatest ever made, that seals your reputation forever. Oh yeah. And like you say,
and he did. He just loved it, and he would. It was always the funny stories he used to tell about him when he first came to Hollywood. That when he didn't have work and nobody knew who he was, that he would just walk up and down Hollywood Boulevard and recite Shakespeare, and he was sort of like a curiosity in Hollywood at the time. Was this Shakespearean character who wandered the boulevard and would recite Shakespeare to the palm trees. So
wow, that's interesting.
He was quite a guy. Yeah, he was, and then we go up to the Hollywood Bowl at night when like at 2:00 in the morning when nobody was there, and he would recite Shakespeare to all those empty seats to build up his voice. Back when he was young, and would go up there to make sure that he was able to project. So wow. he just loved it. He just was absolutely a disciple of acting and just loved every minute of it.
John Carradine, one of his not so memorable films, because I can't even think of the title of it. I don't know if you can, Gary, but it's the one where a little girl is kidnapped. It's one of Ted's.
Oh no, that was a little boy. What is the name of that? I can't think of the name of the movie. It wasn't that bad though. It was a pretty good film, and it wasn't one that Ted directed. It was one that he did the cinematography for. Somebody else directed it.
Okay,
but it was him, and then I can't think of his name. He. That had a few stars in it. I'll have to look it up.
Okay. So Ted did the cinematography on that.
He did the cinematography on that one.
The Astro Zombies sequels that Gary and I worked on in a very unusual way did feature John Carradine, even though John Carradine had passed away many years before, because Ted had a wax replica of his head made, and that John Carradine head played an important part in both of the Astro Zombie sequels.
Yes, he was continually trying to destroy the world from his fish tank.
Yeah, from his fish tank.
Well, I will have to check that out. You got to give me the title of that so I can see that one.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's an ignominious, whatever. Yeah. How do you say that word? Ending for a guy who was in Stagecoach and the Grapes of Wrath.
Just to be ahead in a fish tank.
End up in Ted V. Michael's fish tank. Well, moving from fish tanks to curses, the Curse of the Cat People was quite different from the original Cat People film, and Val Lewton and Robert Wise, as you mentioned last week, were involved in the making of The Curse of the Cat People, and their careers prospered afterwards, even though this production was 9 days behind schedule and cost so much that its budget was raised from $147,000 to $212,000. So they somehow survived the rule in Hollywood that you come in under budget and on time. Can you tell us a little bit about the Curse of the Cat People?
With Curse of the Cat People, they got that wasn't Wise didn't take the blame for that, because there had been an earlier director named Gunther von Fritsch, and Gunther was he's a very fine director, and he was very fastidious. And he set up the key ingredients of the film very, very well. But his mortal sin that he committed on that film was that he took too much time, and it was spending too much money. He just couldn't work fast enough. And so what they did basically was they replaced him with Robert Wise, who was the editor on the film. And Wise had been hoping for some time to get a chance to direct. And he said that he was finally, called by the producer one night and said, "Look, Gunther von Fritsch is just too slow. He's not going to be there Monday morning. We're going to replace him over the weekend." And, so do you want a chance to direct? And Wise said he felt kind of bad because he liked Gunther von Fritsch, and he felt bad, kind of sort of taking his job from him, and that, wished he could have done something to defend him. And he hesitated just a moment, and the producer said, look, he said, let me emphasize, if you're not, either you're directing it for the picture Monday or somebody else is directing the picture Monday, it would not be Gunther von Fritsch directing the picture on Monday. So by the time Wise came into it, he worked well, and he had been, he was very fastidious, and he was able to work quite fast and kind of bring it up a little, so it wasn't a complete financial disaster and didn't go, completely wacky over schedule. But that was the problem with that. With the original director, actually was simply just could not get into the groove to get it, moving the way that he wanted to. And then, of course, what happened was that after the film had been completed, and of course, we should mention that Luton once again decided he was going to take an entirely different route. He was given this title, "The Curse of the Cat People," and thought, "Oh no, not again! What am I going to do with this?" He decided to make it about a little girl. He made it about the little girl who was the daughter of the widower of the cat woman in the movie, Simone, and the woman that he had married. And that it would be looking into her imaginative mind and how she was getting into trouble, and he did this remarkable crazy thing where he brought back the character that Simone had played, the Catwoman, and brought her back almost like an angel, right? like an angel that he came back and spoke to the little girl and this sort of thing. So it's a very, very strange film. But then he decided he did, and a wonderful film, but he decided he didn't like it at the ending, at the end. So he put the film back into production again, and of course that added to the cost by shooting a revised ending later on. So, and in that one, that's the one where Elizabeth Russell, as the spinster in the house, comes up the steps and scares the little girl, and it's very, very moody and scary, and so on and so forth. And I have a kind of a strange story about that scene, which you might enjoy. And that is that Elizabeth Russell, I knew quite well. She had played the original Catwoman in Cat People. She's the one the lady in the restaurant who actually looks somewhat like a cat, kind of feline. And she stands up and walks over to Simone and says, "Moja sestra," which means my sister, all right, in Serbian. And you never see her again. She makes this one incredible, vivid moment count, it's great impact, and goes away. Well, she had a larger part then in Curse of the Cat People, in which she's this lonely young woman who's living in this spooky mansion. And at the end of the picture, as I say, she comes up in this revised ending and scares a little girl. Well, years ago, I watched the film with Elizabeth Russell, who at that point was in her mid-80s. And we watched it at a film convention in Baltimore. And we watched the film, and it got near the end, and it got to the part where she was coming up the stairs, and she looks really scary coming up the stairs. I mean, she looks like Lucifer's mistress or something coming up the stairs. She's really very, very frightening, wonderful, scary presence about her, and also very beautiful. That was a great thing with Elizabeth Russell. She was very beautiful, but she also was very scary in the movies. Interesting combination. So she's coming up the stairs in this scene to scare the little girl, and Elizabeth Russell is sitting next to me. She's sitting to my left. And I look over at her, and she is watching the screen, and she is just frozen. All right, she's just staring at the screen, like frozen, watching this scene play, seeing herself from back in 1943. All right, when the film was shot, and at that point it was about 1990. All right, so a long time had passed, and she's watching this scene, and shortly after that, the film ends. And everybody in the room applauded. And Elizabeth Russell got up, and no exaggeration, she ran out of the room. She ran out of the room.
Oh.
And she ran out into the corridor outside the screening room, and she ran along the screening room, on the second level above the lobby. She ran to the escalator. She got to the escalator. She did not ride down the escalator. She ran down the escalator. She ran across the lower lobby. She ran through the door, and she headed for the garage. And I was chasing her the entire time. All right? I mean, I didn't know what to do. I mean, she was obviously in an absolute state of panic.
Yeah.
And I finally caught up with her, and she turned around. She was finally winded. I mean, she had run a very long way, actually. And I finally caught up with her, and she turned around, and she kind of laughed and kind of collected herself. And she never actually articulated, but what I could gather was that she just was so frightened or unnerved at seeing herself from all those years before, and seeing herself being presented in such a scary way, and seeing herself, so dramatic and intense and youthful and all these things on the screen at that point, that she had, equating herself at that point in her life with herself back in 1943 had gotten to her, and she just literally panicked and ran.
Wow.
And I remember taking her back in because they had a question and answer session, and I brought her back in. Of course, everybody was, waiting to see what was going to happen. And I brought her back in, and she sat on the stage, and then she was fine. She calmed down, and she answered questions about the movie and so on and so forth. But I have never seen anything like that happen. I've never seen anyone panic that way and just run like she did. And the movie did it. That Val Lewton movie, just, which she was a very important part, just absolutely, terrified her. And she just literally ran away from it.
What an unusual experience to have.
Very, very. Mm-hmm. And I was very, very fond of her. She was a very sweet lady and a very, very nice lady, and totally humble. I mean, if you talk to her about the great impact she made in those films, she just would kind of shake her head like, where are you coming from? Why are you saying that? I mean, I wasn't really all that good, or I wasn't really all these things. And but she was not a fan of herself in any way, stretch or form. And she just was. But she was. She really was. She was a remarkable actress, even though she didn't know it. And maybe that was part of it too, just seeing how much power she had on screen back in those days and presence surprised her. And it was, like seeing herself in another life, and all she went.
Wow.
Would you say, Greg, that Curse of the Cat People, it's been described by some as a touching and psychologically complex family film couched in a ghost story. Would you agree with that?
That's a very good description. Yes, it is. It's a very, very fine description. It really is, because it really gets into the mind of all these people. It gets very much into the mind of the little girl. It gets very much into the mind of the father, who is trying very hard to be a good father, but it's like just can't help himself, just keeps hitting all the wrong notes all the time. It gets into the point of the view of the mother. It gets into the point of the angel character that Simone plays. And it gets into the mind of the Russell character, who you really feel very sorry for, because she's just incredibly lonely in the movie. She's just, she lives with her aged mother in the movie, and the mother dies, and she's all alone, and she's angry at the little girl for having received a lot of affection from her mother while the mother was alive. And you even feel sorry for her. So it's kind of a case history, a psychological history of everybody in that film in about 70 minutes. And also, at various times manages to be, a very good horror film. It has its moments. It has the typical, what they call the Val Lewton bus, which they used to put in all the films, which was like a sudden visual and moment and a sound moment that was calculated to make the audience scream, and usually was something very harmless. In the original Cat People, it was a bus that pulls up and releases its brakes while the heroine Jane Randolph is walking through Central Park and is afraid the Catwoman is stalking her. And suddenly this bus pulls up, and the brakes go off and the doors fly open. And they said, when that movie played in 1942, people just jumped out of their seats because the tension had built up, and all of a sudden this little bit would release it. So it's a great movie. It's one of my favorite movies. My two favorite Lewton movies are Curse of the Cat People and The Body Snatcher. And Cat People is definitely up there as well.
Oh, absolutely. Now, continuing with the Cat People, there was the remake in the 80s. And so my question for you, because I watched that recently as well, just as like to compare the two, there's not really a whole lot other than a couple of scenes that were kept the same. What are your feelings about remakes like that from original material? I mean, because there's been a few, with Frankenstein, Dracula, The Thing from Another Planet, which was redone by John Carpenter. How do you feel some of them get it right or some of them completely miss the original concept?
Well, of course, the problem is that very frequently the original film is so good that it's almost virtually impossible to top, and they have to come up with either an entirely new concept, at which they're in trouble for not sticking to the original story and making it an actual remake, or they're forced to force it, to put things in there that are going to be put in for the point of view of just kind of like horror for horror's sake, or blood for blood's sake, or violence for violence sake, or that sort of thing. And sometimes that kind of stuff can work. I mean, I wouldn't say that for example, even though I like the older horror films, I wouldn't say that none of the new ones are fine horror films, and I wouldn't say that there's no place for blood and gore in certain horror films. The modern ones, but it's all theater, and it has to be calculated to be used in the right way. And if it's not used in the right way, it can just misfire. And if it misfires, then you just have a mess. So I think there were a lot of things good about the Cat People remake. I thought that that Natasha Kinski was very good, and I thought that Ned O'Toole was very good, and they did some interesting things with the pool sequence, which is one of the famous shock episodes in it, and so on. But it just I don't know how long it's going to be remembered as a classic film, or as the original is going to be up there forever.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the things that makes the original so wonderful is the use of sound and shadow.
Oh yeah,
what you don't see that allows your imagination to run wild. Yes, absolutely. That's the thing, and that's what Luton used to say, and Karloff used to say, and a lot of the people who were masters at this would say that if you allow the audience to be the actor, they'll come up with something far worse than any actor or any director or any screenwriter or whatever is ever going to come up with. They'll imagine something. They'll go in their own psyche and come up with something imaginative that will scare them worse than anything that you can do to scare them. So, yeah, good point. Absolutely. So you have plenty of experience with horror films. What would you recommend for our viewers if they, let's say younger folks who probably haven't watched some of these older classics, or maybe somebody who's willing to give them a shot for the first time? What would you say would be your top 5 that anybody should start out with, or if you're just a movie lover, you should be watching it because it should be on your list?
Well, I would say the original Frankenstein. I think the original Frankenstein has sort of a magic about it, in my opinion, that always works. And again, because of particularly the direction by James Whale, and particularly the star performances by Karloff and Colin Clive, they're really incredible. I would say that Bride of Frankenstein is a remarkable film. What Karloff manages to do in that film is almost miraculous. As the monster, as far as the monster coming to developing his soul and so on and so forth. It's a marvelous film. It has some great humor in it, and it's a really, really cool movie. A film that we mentioned briefly earlier is the film The Black Cat, which was the first film that Karloff and Lugosi made together.
Yeah.
They both just devour the screen in that. They're both brilliant. They made 8 films together, but this is one of probably the only one in which they really are on equal footing as far as them both having comparably great roles. And watching those two legends together in that film is really should be watched, because of the fact that they really were such phenomenally fine actors, and to see them playing off each other in that is wonderful. And plus, the film itself is, and I mean this in a complimentary way, it's so incredibly sick. I mean, it has everything in it. It has necrophilia, and it has a black mass, and it has a skinning alive at the end, and so on and so forth. And I mean, it's a very, very disturbing film, and it's a very horrific film for that reason. And so I would suggest people watch that one. Back to Val Lewton, I would say The Body Snatcher. Again, is a great film. It's of course based on Robert Louis Stevenson's story. It has marvelous atmospheres, directed by Robert Wise. Karloff gives what many people consider his greatest performance, even more so than the Frankenstein monster in it, and he is great. Bela Lugosi has a good cameo appearance, if you will, in it, and really shows what he could do in sort of a straight acting role, as opposed to an actual horror role. And so I would suggest that one, and I would suggest the 1963 version of The Raven, which is basically a comedy, and it's just wonderful to see Vincent Price and Peter Lorre and Boris Karloff all having fun, which they really do. They just have a romp in that movie, and they really do have a blast. And something that I'm thinking of while I'm saying that of course these are all films that are, most people now see on their television screen. They don't see them in theater, and films were of course all originally designed to be seen with other people in a theater for the reaction, and which had a lot to do with how the film ultimately went over. And one story I always remember is when I was about, I guess, maybe 9 or 10 years old. The film House of Usher came out with Vincent Price.
Oh, that's a good one.
The AIP film, and it's a terrific film. And it came out in the summer, and I remember going with my cousin in Baltimore to see the film, and the theatrical response of the audience, which were mostly kids, I'll never forget it. I mean, they were just so scared, and they screamed. I never heard screaming, my life till the afternoon that I saw that movie. And things would happen when when Madeline Usher was trying to get out of the casket and so on and so forth. The kids would scream, and they'd run up the aisle and hide in the back of the theater, and it was almost like they were part of the show. Yeah. Seeing them respond to it that way. And I remember we came home that night, and we were so scared. He had a little pup tent in his backyard, my cousin, and we slept in the pup tent and that night, and we were terrified out there. I mean, we were afraid that Vincent Price was walking up and down in the alley. Yeah. He was going to come in through the gate any minute. And finally, at one point, my cousin said to me, "I have to go and ask my mother a question." And he went in. He never came back. He left me out there.
Oh no!
It was yeah. And so it really impressed me with the with the power of the theatrical power. And later years, I did a lot of acting in the Baltimore area and so on, and stage acting. And I would think about the fact that how important it is to try to grab an audience the way that film, grabbed an audience. It was, I know people don't necessarily, think that much of Roger Corman as a showman, but as a directorial genius or anything of that nature. But in that particular case, that film just was it worked. It hit all the buttons, and man, those kids came out of that theater just absolutely emotionally exhausted. And, and we went and saw it again the next day.
I believe it. Well, I think
they screamed again. Everybody screamed again and ran out of the theater, and it was the same thing. It got to him the second time. So,
well, there's something about Roger Corman. I'm a huge Roger Corman fan. I think he's a fantastic director, and there's a lot of modern day directors that were heavily influenced, or they said they came from the school of Roger Corman. But he really did influence cinema in a big way. And also, talking about audience experience, I think William Castle, who's part of that same group there, also, that audience experience, putting skeletons on cables that would come down during, the movie, or The Shocker, where he had buzzers in the seats, or 13 Ghosts, where you could put up the visor and see the ghost or make it disappear. I mean, something I think is completely lost on audiences today.
It is, and that's absolutely what it's really all about, is getting in touch with your audience, doing whatever you have to do to get the audience emotionally involved and get them into the palm of your hand. And the great directors were able to do it, as we were saying, and Corman did it. And like I say, I don't think he's ever received the credit that's due him.
Oh no!
For what he did with his films, and because so many of them are so fondly remembered, and people, so many of them are beloved movies.
Oh,
and,
absolutely.
Because he knew what he was doing, and he was able to package what he was doing so effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And he was he's. Well, he's how old is Corman at this point? Is he like close to 100?
He's got to be. The funny thing is, he's still working in movies. He still produces films and does stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, he's still very active in this business.
That's what I was going to say. The great thing is that he's still working, and that's the important thing. The important thing is that after all these years, he is still in there doing what he does so well, and that nothing's ever discouraged him, and He's just great. He's just great. I know at times it must have been tough working for him. I remember an actress named Betsy Jones Moreland appearing at a convention, and she had made work for Roger Corman, and somebody said, "What was the experience like?" And she said, "It was pretty dangerous." And somebody said, what do you mean dangerous? And she said, whenever you work for Roger, you always you end up either maimed or dead.
That's very true.
That may have been, but whatever happened, it certainly got up there on the screen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of my favorite stories about Roger Corman is when he directed the original Little Shop of Horrors, I believe he did it in 3 days. It was a ridiculous amount.
Incredible.
It's a very short amount of time. Everything was run and gun. But, I mean, not only did it make a lasting impression on audiences, but inspired an off-Broadway play, which later got turned into a musical film and is going to be remade sometime I think this year or next year with an all-star cast. Yeah.
I'll be darned. Yeah, well, see, that's what I mean. He knew what he was doing. He had the vision all the time. And he didn't have to waste time. He didn't have to have a whole big long schedule because he knew what he wanted and how he wanted it, and came in with it all in his head. And that's a wonderful talent for a filmmaker to have.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of those old time directors, Gary and Greg, they plan on working until the last moment on their deathbed because.
A lot of them
that
do.
was the same with our friend Ted V. Michaels. He was, on his deathbed in his final days, still trying to
direct a movie.
If you can believe it.
Literally,
over 60.
That's what keeps them going. That's what brings the stimulus in and keeps them going and keeps them fired up and adds years to their lives and. It was like Karloff at the end, working in a wheelchair and having oxygen nearby on the set and all that sort of thing. But he said, this is wonderful because, when you're working, you forget all the other, difficult things that are happening in your life and you can just focus on the work and do what you love. And it just makes all the difference. Absolutely. So that's great. That is great.
What an inspiration for us all. Well,
absolutely.
Before we wrap up for the evening, there's one last thing that Gary and I were wondering about, and in your book, I believe it was, we read about you visiting some very unusual movie locations.
Oh, yeah.
Including one connected with Frankenstein.
Oh, yes. That was, of course, Malibu Lake, which is where the famous scene was shot where the monster plays with flowers with the little girl, with little Maria, and gets bewildered and picks her up and throws her into the lake. And it's interesting. I always wondered for years and years and years where they shot that scene. And I heard all kinds of answers. Somebody said that, they had the lake up on the hill at Universal and they went up there. And somebody said it was out at Lake Sherwood out in the valley and there and so on and so forth. We went back and forth and back and forth. And finally, one day, a musician friend of mine mentioned that he had played at a party at Malibu Lake. And I said, I wonder if there's any chance that that's the lake. And we drove out there. It's a very long drive, way out. It's actually about 10 miles from the ocean. And up in the mountains, the Santa Monica Mountains. And we drove in, and they had a little office there at Malibu Lake. And I went in, and I had the famous still, from the movie of the monster kneeling down opposite Little Maria. And I said, can you identify the background? They said, look right out this window. And you looked at the window, and there was the exact topography.
Wow.
of the hills and the mountains. They said it was right out there. They would have been, and I can take it to the exact spot based on that picture and based on the background. And it was very, very unusual because it was interesting because right about the same time, I had made friends with Marilyn Harris, who played Little Maria, and had told me all about the shooting. And it was so cool because she just absolutely loved Boris Karloff as the monster. She never saw him except as the monster, and she just absolutely loved him. And again, tragic case. She had a very horrible stepmother, sadistic stepmother who treated her horribly. And I said stepmother, I should say adopted mother, a mother who had adopted her for the purpose of putting her into movies, and who treated her abominably and tortured her and did just unspeakable things. And she was terrified of this woman. And yet she went up. She saw Karloff at Universal that morning, with his makeup on and the electrodes in his neck and all those things. And she said, I walked right up to him and took his hand and said, "Can I ride with you out to the lake?"
Oh.
And he said, "Oh, would you please, darling?" And she said, "Oh, yes." And so she said they became instant friends, and she just loved him all her life, although she only really knew him from working with him, those couple of days out at Malibu Lake.
Wow.
And to the extent she said that he died in 1969, and she said the weekend that he died, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I hadn't heard anything that he had died, but I just couldn't stop thinking about him. And I sat down and wrote him a letter and said, "Dear Mr. Karloff, I only worked with you that one time in Frankenstein, but I've loved you all my life, and I've always thought about you, and you were so gentle, and you were so kind, and you were all these wonderful things, and I just want to let you know how I feel." And she said she took the letter out Monday morning to put it in her mailbox and turned on the radio before she went outside, and the radio announced that he had died the previous day. So she never got to send him the letter. But she was just in love with him. She just, as a little 7-year-old girl, she just was absolutely in love with him, whereas, she was just terrified of life with her mother. And in fact, she said that when Karloff, picked her up the first time and threw her out into the lake, that her mother was just hysterically excited, by all this. And her mother screamed, "Throw her in again! Throw her in again!" It was just, and that just haunted her. So she was haunted by this woman all her life. And yet she, was just cherished this memory of Boris Karloff and all that had happened out at Malibu Lake. So it's a beautiful place. And, still very, very remote, very, up in the mountains and very idyllic looking, lovely pastoral spot. And, a lot of incredible movie magic happened there.
And on this memorable moment, this beautiful moment between Boris Karloff and the little girl, I think that's probably a fitting place for us to say that we have certainly appreciated you being with us this evening, Greg, and I've been sitting here totally entertained and enthralled by everything you've been saying. Can you just remind our listeners one more time where they can find you on the internet?
Yes. First of all, thank you again, both of you, Richard and Gary, for having me. It was a great pleasure talking with you. And they can reach me. Your listeners can reach me. I'll be very happy to hear from any of them about anything we discussed today, or if they're interested in buying one of the recent books or anything of that nature. My website is www.gregorymank, and that's GREGORYMANK, all one word, .com, www.gregorymank.com. And the books, as I mentioned, also are for sale on Amazon. But yeah, please drop me a line at my address, and I'd be very, very happy to hear from any of your listeners. And as I say, it certainly has been a pleasure talking with both of you gentlemen this evening. So thank you very, very much.
You're welcome, and thank you again. And folks, that was a very incredible story, and actually a series of incredible stories within that. So,
oh yeah, the finest film historian I've ever talked to in my life. I'm Richard.
I'm Gary, and we hope you'll join us again next week for more incredible stories. So until next time, we'll see you here.